Today's episode has been brought to you by Offering Tree. Have you heard of Offering Tree? It is an amazing all-in-one software. It's what I actually use to register students for my online classes, workshops, and trainings. Offering Tree is also a company that really cares about yoga teachers, and they are listening to what teachers and studios need. Head on over to offeringtree.com/Shannon for a special podcast listener discount. Today's episode is also brought to you by a workshop that we are hosting very soon. It's called Blurred Lines, the Harmful Intersection of Diet Culture and Yoga. If you are a yoga teacher who is committed to caring for yoga and really following the limbs of yoga, one of which is ahimsa, this workshop is for you. So it talks about how we can take the harmful diet culture out of yoga. I am so excited that we have two amazing hosts for this workshop. Jessica and Alyssa were on a podcast with us this month talking about diet culture and how we can get it out of our yoga spaces. They are going to be leading this workshop. To check it out, head on over to theconnectedyogateacher.com/anti-diet, or we'll put a link in the show notes for you. I also wanted to say hello and welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. My pronouns are she, her, and this podcast is being recorded on Anishinaabeg, Odawa, and Mississauga land, also called the Bruce Peninsula in Ontario, Canada. If you are new here, you might not know that I'm also a mom of three, a yoga teacher, and the founder of Pelvic Health Professionals. And if you are a returning listener, you know the drill. This podcast was created for you, the yoga teacher, so that each and every week you can be connected to the inspiration and information that is going to support you through the tough days of building and running a yoga business. And I get it. I remember what it was like to leave yoga teacher training, where I felt like I had built this community of support where we were learning together, and to just dive out into the wilderness of being a yoga teacher out there on my own, even when I found other yoga teachers in my community. It can feel really isolating at times, especially when we get into topics like we are going to talk about in today's episode. Today, we're going to talk about science and spirituality. So historically, there has been some friction between science and spirituality. And some people might even think that they're polar opposites and they cannot coexist. I have Stevie Inghram on the podcast today to share some of their insights about the integration of science and spirituality and their intersection with modern medicine and holistic health and medicine. There is a lot in this episode. I am so excited for you to hear this. Also, I'm really excited if you have not met Stevie yet. Stevie Inghram is a queer and trans feminine yoga therapist who holds a Master of Science in Yoga Therapy and has been teaching yoga for over a decade. As a yoga therapist, Stevie's primary work is focused on healing the trauma that is so pervasive in the queer and transgender communities. Stevie also hosts a podcast called Queer Story Time via Instagram that is focused on sharing stories from the gender and sexually expansive GSE communities and advocates for expanding GSE competencies in healthcare training programs. Stevie also teaches GSE competencies at several yoga therapy training programs and is writing on the topic for Yoga Therapy Today while also being a passionate advocate for science and evidence-informed practice in the holistic medicine world. They are a strong believer that a middle ground can be truly found, one that simultaneously respects the scientific method and cares for the whole person. Now, as I said, we talked about a lot in today's podcast episode. Stevie shares more about their background and how they came to be passionate about both science and spirituality. We talk about how science and spirituality are both human endeavors of discovery and why people think we have to choose between them. Stevie also shares their thoughts on spiritual bypassing in yoga, what feels toxic in yoga spaces, and how we can nurture our spirituality while also promoting science. This was such a wonderful conversation with Stevie, and it really got me thinking about how we can practice and communicate our yoga while still leaning towards science and combating misinformation. I'm so excited for you to meet Stevie today, so let's dive in. Welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast, Stevie. It's so great to have you here today.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here and be here in front of everybody in the community listening.
Tell our Connected Yoga teachers, what is the work that you do and who do you do it for?
Okay. So, this is a great question. I think it's good to provide a little bit of context for the conversation that we're about to have. So I grew up as a pastor's kid. I've always been a pastor's kid. My dad is still a pastor of a United Methodist church and always has been since I've been alive. And so funny enough, I have kind of been a little bit of a rebel growing up as a pastor's kid. I always had an interest in science. So, today's conversation is going to be kind of about the intersection of science and spirituality. And really, I have embodied that my entire life, given my father's role in the world. And also given my interest in science since I was a little kid. I was a huge fan of Bill Nye the Science Guy. And then of course, having, as a queer and trans person, having issues with the Christian church and seeking my own spiritual healing because of that. And that led me to yoga and Buddhism. And so I'm passionate about how can we bridge these two areas when there is, so much of a divide on these topics, because we need both science and spirituality. So I look forward to explaining a little bit more about that.
That's amazing. And before we hit record, you said that you're on a break right now from school. So you're also studying to be a naturopathic doctor. Is that right?
Yes, I'm studying to become a naturopathic physician, which is obviously a little bit more holistically oriented. And that's actually another reason why I'm passionate about this, because, people think naturopaths, well, some naturopaths, it's a whole other subject area, but people think that naturopaths are anti-science and against medication and all of these things. And, my training is very similar to what allopathic physicians and osteopathic physicians get in their training, in addition to all of the natural treatments that we learn. So there's an integration of these things in that as well. But yes, I have one more quarter left not one more quarter left of my second year, moving into my third year this fall. So I still have a couple years left.
How many years is it?
Well, I have personally decided to do the 5-year track. It's at a little bit of a slower pace, but it's really not. It's still intense. So you can do, a 4 to 6 year track depending on how quickly you want to move along. But it's every bit as rigorous as, allopathic or osteopathic medical school.
Yeah. I used to work for a naturopathic doctor who was a yoga teacher, and we would sometimes get students, and I just felt like they were really, kind of pushed to their limit of studying, being in the clinic there, and just a lot coming at them at once.
It is not a joke, and thank God for yoga. Otherwise, I wouldn't be making it for med school, to be completely honest.
Yeah. So tell me then, when did your yoga journey start? You said you were always interested in science.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
how long ago was it that you started doing yoga?
At the time I had no awareness of my trans identity, but I did have awareness of my queer identity in college. And, hearing messages as a pastor's kid, growing up in the environment that I did that were anti-LGBT, and just taking that in over periods of time, you really begin to hold on to that. And it wasn't until college that I began experiencing panic attacks. And I remember calling my mother one day being like, what is going on? Like, I feel like I'm dying. because I had never experienced a panic attack previously. And so, my mom's a social worker and, is involved in the medical world and does the work that she does as a social worker. And so she said, "You're just having a panic attack, breathe." And so this happened a couple times beyond that. And there was one point where I just remember saying to myself, "I can't live like this. I have to find something to learn how to calm myself down." And just intuitively, I said, "Hey, what's this yoga thing?" At the time, knowing nothing about it. So and it was also around the time too when I started studying Buddhism, which is, of course, is one of the other Dharmic traditions. Really just searching for meaning and healing, after growing up hearing anti-LGBT messages, growing up from people in the church, and just from the church at large. So yeah, when was that? That was probably my sophomore year of college. So maybe 2008 is when all of this started.
Right.
And then I made it through my undergrad, and I was still studying yoga, myself, but really wanted to do a training, and that's I believe I did my first yoga training in 2012. So
It's been a while now then,
it's been a
already
while.
10 years. Uh, Thank you for sharing all of that. It really helps to understand why you're so passionate about this as well, and I love that the science was there and you had those questions. So, what do you tell people if they're like, "Wait a second, it's" like, sometimes the message I hear is you either follow science or you follow spirituality, like, you can't follow both. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's BS, to put it bluntly. Yeah, one of the amazing teachings I think about the Dharmic traditions, and this is broadly speaking, extending beyond yoga into Buddhism and some of the other Dharmic traditions, is just this overall idea of interconnectedness. And so for me, as someone who's studied this for a decade plus, and been teaching it, and also somebody who daily is studying science as a medical student, um, I look for the interconnection between these things. So much in this world is divisive and divided, and I don't think that it is beneficial, to any of us as yogis, um, to be continuing to propagate this idea that science and spirituality are separate, because they're really not. Science and spirituality are both human endeavors of discovery. And I think that's something that's really important for people to note is, yes, spiritually speaking, we have inner ways of knowing. Scientifically speaking, we have systems and processes of knowing, and both of those can be honored. There doesn't have to be this divisive divide between those things, um, which I think is, largely why we've seen the division during this pandemic, because that division has been exacerbated to the extreme, um, with all of the misinformation that's being propagated in the yoga community. And I think this divide that people see between science and spirituality has been the impetus for that to continue. And as I was telling you, when we were talking, um, before recording, I think when I came into the yoga community a decade ago, I remember thinking, what is all this anti science stuff? It was there all along and always has been. I just like, this is one of the things that pops off the top of my head, is that when yoga teachers say, oh, being in a twisting posture detoxifies the body. What mechanism is there for that? And so it's just little things like this that get said in the yoga space that, even from the time that I kind of entered the yoga community, I was saying, well, what's going on here? Um, And so that's, yeah, I hope that's answering your question. That was a long-winded answer.
It's so good. It's so good. I find a ton of comfort in science. I studied science well into college, and I love when there's this very like. Well, I was even telling my partner Sean today. I was thinking about my own scientific experiment with this like nasty weed that we have going on our lawn, and he's also a science geek, and
Nice.
and I was like, how could we control this where we know if this is working? Anyway, all that to say that I also, like you, came into the yoga world. Maybe I didn't ask as many questions when I first came into the yoga world. I kind of came in and was like, well, this teacher said that this pose is good for this thing and this thing. And so I'll repeat those cues. And then as time went on and I heard other people questioning those cues and those things that we just say, then I started really tipping towards where I was looking for the science. And I would say there are times where I think, well, but we'll never have all of this science to explain what's happening. So
Right.
how do you balance that in your own teaching or your own practice or your own life?
Yeah, and this is, both the thing that science and spirituality share in common is they're both systems of discovery, systems of uncovering. Science has very stringent the scientific method in and of itself has very stringent standards, so that we can look at a phenomena going on in the world in the least biased way as possible, because the human mind is incredibly biased. And so we have systems in place that take away those biases through various statistical methods. And I am, by no means an expert on that yet. So you might have to talk to a PhD scientist about that. But there are very, stringent standards and processes that help us take away those biases. But in regards to spirituality, I would say, science, the reality is science being science, and just the nature of reality in general is this is another Dharmic teaching, is things are always changing and evolving. And so we may not have the understanding now, but that doesn't negate all the science that led up to a particular understanding. There's been this narrative, throughout the pandemic that scientists don't they don't have an understanding about masks or about vaccines and all of these issues. And specifically really on the masks. And, there's not really been a time in history. I think the last pandemic was over 100 years ago. And the last major pandemic, which I believe was the Spanish flu. And so there really has not been a widespread pandemic like this, to do the necessary research on these things. And so it all happened literally within the last year or two. And so again, science evolves with the times. And I think in regards to spirituality, we have to understand that regardless of whether science itself, and this is where the balance is found, regardless of whether science itself ever confirms any number of spiritual experiences that people have, the reality is spirituality creates meaning and value and connection in people's lives. And the truth of the matter is we don't need science to explain that to us. If it is meaningful and valuable and connects us and, gives us a connection to our fellow human beings beyond ourselves, then that's a good thing. There's already so much division in this world. And, we don't necessarily need science to validate that, but, science, of course, these days is validating that. So it's this dichotomy between, yes, it's important to have science, especially in medicine and especially in the midst of a pandemic. It's important to have evidence that has gone through these rigorous scientific processes to say this is what we know based off of the scientific process, and we've gone through these processes to take out all bias as much as possible, um, and say based off of that this is what we know about a particular phenomena. And so we can hold space for that while also holding space for spiritual experience, um, that, as I said, is meaningful, is valuable, and connects us not only to ourselves and our truth, our dharma, as we say in yoga, but also to life beyond ourselves, to fellow human beings, whether that's a partner, friends, family, or just the world at large.
I love that. I love how you are so passionate about the science and just as much about the spirituality part. I can sense it when you're talking, and it really gets me excited. I also have to say that it's made me think as you're talking about this. I think that I have been leaning heavy on the science side of things since the pandemic
Yeah.
because I'm trying to swing the pendulum in the yoga world. Do you ever feel that way as well?
Oh God. Yes. Yes. I mean, yeah, I felt that. I felt this for the last decade or two. I just, at that time in my life, I had this internal knowing that this is not right, that there's an imbalance here, but I didn't back then, I didn't have the ability to articulate what I'm articulating right now. So I very much, I very much feel that way. Even though I myself have this, I think many of us feel this way. I have this inner yearning for, more yogic knowledge and wisdom. Um, but also acknowledging the reality that, and this is the truth of the matter, I very rarely go to a yoga studio because it's generally very toxic. It's, appropriating yoga. Um, it's also largely anti-scientific, and I that's just the way it's always been over this last decade. Is that there's been kind of very few people that I trust to hold space for all of what we're talking about, and there are people doing it in the yoga community. That's for sure. I don't want to negate anybody who is doing this work. I know that they're out there, but it's been hard. It's been hard because there's so much disinformation that's overwhelming, um, that it's almost like to rebalance the scale. We've had to set spirituality aside a little bit and swing the pendulum in the other direction to say, hey, no, let's have these conversations about science. And I still, I have this churning inside myself daily as I, you know, parse the world of naturopathic medicine with my colleagues who, people that go into this form of medicine are more holistically minded, a little bit more hippy dippy, shall we say. um, and having to parse conversations that, are maybe uncomfortable with people that have views that don't align with science. And so it's tough to navigate, but I think the tougher thing to do, and I'm so grateful to you for having me here, the tougher thing to do is avoid this conversation
Right.
because it has created so much harm during this pandemic to have the scales tipped in the side of the anti-science in the yoga and wellness and holistic health world. Um, that, as I said, we need to kind of swing the pendulum in the other direction to kind of balance things out. So I'm not surprised that you're feeling that way. I'm very much feeling that way myself. Um, and I'm sure other people in the community are as well. I know there's some big voices in the yoga community that are speaking out on these things, that are probably feeling the same way. And so it's interesting, in this time when this pendulum has to, go in this other direction, that we have our spiritual practice to reground us.
Yes.
I don't think any of us would have made it through this pandemic, and COVID aside, but going through the stresses of this pandemic if we didn't have these practices
So
to
true.
center ourselves. Yeah.
It's so true. You
Yeah.
had mentioned, you know, shying away from yoga classes right now because some of them feel toxic. And I wanted to touch on one thing that I notice in the yoga world. I also want to say I do notice it in myself as well from being so much steeped in the yoga world for a long time is spiritual bypassing. Will you talk to
Oh,
us about
Lord,
what
honey.
what is that? What does it look like? Like what does it even look like within ourselves
What
or
is spiritual
yeah. Yeah.
bypassing? Um,
Or give us an example of spiritual bypassing maybe.
yes. So I would. Uh, Here's a prime example of spiritual bypassing, because this is the narrative in the yoga community: is we are all light, love, and oneness, and that may well be the case in a spiritual sense. But the spiritual bypassing comes, and this was so evident in the pandemic, when you broadly apply that light, love, and oneness to people having COVID, people dying of COVID, to promoting misinformation. If you truly believed in light, love, and oneness, you would want to take care of and protect people, um, as per, ahimsa, non harm. Um, and that's not what is happening here. The spirit and that's, I think, in a nutshell, really what spirit bypassing is when you have these broad generalizations, broad spiritual ideas that everyone's interconnected, which is true, or that somehow you're this enlightened being, and that you don't care about the problems of the world, or it's really, as the name of it says, it's using your spirituality to bypass the modern issues of the world, to say that you're not political, to say that you don't care about science, to say that you don't care about taking care of other people during a massive worldwide pandemic. Um, that's really, I think, the root of spiritual bypassing, and that's been just so evident throughout the pandemic.
It has been for sure. One thread of this, which correct me if I'm wrong, that this feels like spiritual bypassing to me, is this idea of, well, just manifest what you want and it will happen. Like all you have to do is really feel it and see it, and then you'll manifest it. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of people on this planet that cannot do that because of their place in the world in so many on so many levels. Do you want to talk a little bit about
Absolutely.
that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's another prime example. Is Well, first of all, we need to recognize, that this uh, engagement, not engagement, this kind of intersection between like new age spirituality, so to speak, integrating into the yoga space, which, yoga is a 6,000-year-old indigenous Indian practice, um, that has nothing to do with new age spirituality. So we need to acknowledge that that's there, as well. But there's other things like, people misusing the idea that, oh, people are getting COVID because their chakra isn't one of their chakra, is misaligned or not functioning properly, or it's these are deeply spiritual concepts that people are using to bypass, shall I say, modern medical science. And I think and this is, I mean, just as a little aside, this is one thing that, for the number of people in the yoga community that are anti-science and thus anti-trans, anti-LGBT, anti talking about racism, um, you know, all of this anti-science stuff kind of boils down to all of the, to bypassing, to spiritual bypassing, and also to confirmation bias. That's a huge, huge, huge problem. Is to say, there's a narrative among the anti-vaccination movement that, I'm just going to use an example. I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here. So, for example, well, say that person A is talking to person B, and person B tells person A, well, person C had this reaction to the vaccine, and so therefore that should broadly apply to everyone. And the reality is that vaccination is a medical treatment. The reality is that, there are some natural medicine doctors, whether they're medical doctors, osteopathic physicians, naturopathic physicians, that have done harm using natural treatments. So there's a risk and benefit in all of medicine. And it's, again, I come back to the question in this work and in this conversation is, how can we find a middle ground? How can we not bypass? How can we acknowledge our confirmation bias and, deeply and critically think about these things, so that we can find a middle ground between the integration of science and spirituality. So these are deeply complex issues, which is why I think this conversation doesn't get spoken about a lot. But as I said, I think we're continuing to do harm if we don't have this conversation. So, yeah, I don't know if that answered your question.
It did.
There's so much here.
It's so much. I love that you said that this is really like a nuanced conversation and there's a lot to it. I'm popping in here for a moment, Connected Yoga Teachers, to give a shout out of thank you to the team over at Offering Tree. I can tell from using their booking software that they are listening to yoga teachers and adding features that are needed and requested, but also keeping their software simple and well priced to make it easy for yoga teachers and to make it affordable. It's also easy for students to use. I love that when students register, they get a confirmation email, they get text reminders, they get Zoom links, and they get details about the classes or workshops that I'm leading all automatically. I don't have to worry or think about anything once I have things set up, especially time zones. I love that my students, no matter where they are in the world, are going to see the class show up in their time zone. That's really important as I'm teaching online to people all over the world. So if you want things to be easier, if you want to focus less on the technology side of things and focus more on teaching and sharing yoga, go check out offeringtree.com and get our special discount over at offeringtree.com/Shannon. That's offeringtree.com/Shannon. And we have a special discount for our podcast listeners there. Now let's get back to our conversation with Stevie. I'm curious now, is there anything that comes to mind, and I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot with this question, is there anything that comes to mind with regards to how can we, let's say, like a lot of our Connected Yoga Teacher listeners, if they've gotten to this point on the podcast, because we've been covering like science here on the podcast, they're in for that. How can we make sure to nurture the spirituality side of things when we might be really sitting in that science, kind of holding on to the science side of things right now? This is a very I feel like this is a selfish question because I keep thinking of this as you're talking today.
Yeah, I think it's important. The biggest thing that I think we can do is acknowledge what we were talking about earlier, is that we're not going to know everything. Science is not going to be able to validate every singular experience that we have in yoga. And I'm perfectly willing to admit that I have had experiences in yoga, and I'm sure everyone has. I have had experiences in yoga that are absolutely unexplained by science. Some people have out of body experiences, some people have near death experiences, some people have past life experiences, like past lives. And I'm not negating that at all. But what I'm saying is that we can't use those experiences to do harm to other people, because largely, and I'll remind me if I forget to answer your question, but the the issue over the pandemic, and well, beyond the pandemic, like prior to the pandemic, is what I mean, is that people have had this division between science and spirituality in their mind. This idea that almost the two things are siloed. And I think, it's interesting in the scientific community, a lot of people identify with being atheist. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't identify with being atheist. But I think that points to, in the scientific community, that even in the scientific community, people think that there can't be this integration because people are uncomfortable dealing with experiences that may not be explained by science. And I don't think science is a very, we just have to acknowledge this. Science is a very heady, very, critically thinking. And of course, I promote critical thinking. We wouldn't be having this conversation if I didn't. But science is a very heady subject area. And so there's only so much we can do to be a balanced human being, to be like, having these conversations without digging down into our body and re-grounding and reconnecting, because we know how imbalanced we can become when we're thinking about all these heady subject areas. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't have conversations about them, but again, we have to find a balance between these things. Even if we're scientifically minded, we can just be open to experience. Just allow ourselves to be open to experience. I think that's one of the yogic principles is non-attachment or non-possessiveness or non-greediness, like holding on to these stringent ideas. And really, we have to ask ourselves, this entire practice is a liberation practice. It's a relieving of suffering practice. We have to ask ourselves individually. I find myself asking this frequently. Is this causing me suffering? And if you thinking about science all the time is causing you suffering and anxiety and causing you to be in your headspace so much, then maybe that's a good signal that you need to come down and ground and do your practice to rebalance. And that's something that I have to do every single day of my life in medical school. I say to a lot of my colleagues that this being in medical school, it kind of, when you're, I wholeheartedly support science and discovering mechanisms of action and how certain therapeutics work in the body. But when you're studying mechanism of action all the time and studying the science so intensely, it can become very disembodying. I know that from my own experience being in medical school. And it can almost be depleting, like on a soul level, when, and I think that's the thing that people in the yoga community understand, is that there is this experience, this expansive spiritual experience to the human experience. And so it's really about, how can we find a balance between these two things? Yes, we can support mechanism of action, and that's called reductionism in the medical world. We can, reducing things to its smallest part so that we can break it apart and understand it. That's medicine and science. But at the same time, how can we look at the whole as people that are interested in holistic medicine and holistic health? And yoga is a prime example of that. So again, all of us have to go within, ask, is me, being caught up in all of this science causing me suffering? And if it is, okay, well, what tools in your yoga practice can you use to rebalance? Um, and I don't have a straight answer other than that, because it's going to be different for everyone else in regards to what that looks like. So yeah, that's a phenomenal question, but each person individually has to determine what that looks like. But I also, on the flip side, would invite people that are highly spiritual and feel kind of cringy about science, like what can we look at there that is stopping you from understanding science or wanting to investigate and better understand science? Because it's as I said a while back, it's science is another human endeavor of discovery. And as spiritual seekers who are on this constant path of discovery, we should want to be open to all paths of discovery. That includes science. So maybe some self-reflection on both ends of the spectrum for everybody.
This is so like I have so many thoughts right now going on about this. I feel like you've really invited us to look at, okay, if you're, leaning one way pretty heavily, how can you consider um, the the opposite? And it's not really the opposite. They go hand in hand, spirituality and science. And that's so interesting. I love that you called attention to what is in the science world. Maybe we see more atheists, and also in medicine, we might see like leaning more towards that science, and that you're inviting us to check in. I have this thing that I do every morning now. When my alarm goes off, I just ask myself, what would you like the day to look like and feel like?
Mm.
And it's amazing to me that I've made this habit, and that it literally takes me 2 seconds in the morning, and it makes such a difference. And you're saying the same thing of, it's a new question, this one of, is this causing suffering, and how could I relieve that suffering?
Mhm.
That's a really good question, especially for the science communicators out there. I'm thinking that's how I followed your account, was through Wolf. Wolf has
Yes.
done amazing work, and I'm sure that Wolf has times where, you know, she's just tired of, okay, I'm gonna talk science, 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 and,
It's depleting. And that's a thing for any healthcare professionals listening. It's your life is so much science that then you have to come home and communicate science during a massive pandemic, and it's completely disembodying.
yeah.
That doesn't negate the importance of science, but yeah, I just want to give a little shout out to anybody in the healthcare profession who also might be a yoga teacher, to just acknowledge that, to give yourself space to do your practice, and like you said, ask yourself the question about, is this causing me suffering? But I think the other question that we need to ask ourselves is, because the Dharmic traditions, whether it's yoga or Buddhism, Jainism, or any others, um, they are very communal oriented. And so it's not just about how can I relieve my suffering, it's about how can I help relieve the suffering of others. And again, that discrepancy has been what has exacerbated, all this misinformation, and yoga teachers, telling their students not to wear masks and not to get vaccinated. Um, and it's done tremendous level of harm. And so I am just so grateful to be here and have this conversation, because all of us are unintentionally doing harm by not having this conversation. And it's been it's been a decade in the making for me to be able to sit here and articulate all of this. So I'm really grateful to you.
Well, I am so grateful for you sharing all of your thoughts, and I would love to hear from our connected yoga teacher listeners further. Like, I think it's a discussion that needs to keep happening. Some people might be thinking, I want to be done with this conversation. I know I hear from friends and family and colleagues who are saying, like, okay, I want to be done with COVID. Yeah, we all, would like to be done with the pandemic, and conversations like this, and You said that this conversation was 10 years ago for you stepping into the yoga world. Is there anything that you would tell the yoga student walking into a class or the yoga practitioner who walks into a space or a yoga teacher training and they just start to get hints of oh gosh, maybe there's some anti-science misinformation being spread here. What do we do in that? Do we remove ourselves from it? Or do we speak up? Do
That's
we
a phenomenal question. Um, yeah, I think the issue at hand comes down to, um, we use this term, yoga being a science, and it is. But I think the misunderstanding of this entire conversation is that people need to understand. I'm not saying that yoga is not a science. I'm saying that we need to understand and be able to intelligibly distinguish what is yogic science and what is the modern scientific method. Because yoga is this amazing system that has been passed down for 6,000 years that is incredibly detailed and systematic, just like we strive for in the scientific method. The difference is, and this is where a lot of the spiritual bypassing can come in, a lot of the misinformation, a lot of the confirmation bias, is that when people, because of this whole idea of yoga being a science, when people decide to forego modern medical science for yogic science, that's what has happened in this pandemic. And that's what is on prime display in many of these yoga studios, as you're asking about. So the distinction is, the yoga practice is a very deeply personal experience that has us working on relieving our own suffering so that we can then be of service. The word seva is the Sanskrit word for service, selfless service, so that we can live seva out in our daily lives. Because selfless service really in and of itself is a form of liberation, helping other people. And then, the thing that we need to acknowledge about yoga as a science, is that we are working through our own suffering and discovering our true nature in a little bit different of a way than what happens using the scientific method. So in regards to using the scientific method, what happens is a scientist will observe a certain phenomena in the body, in the universe, whatever, and then they'll kind of create a hypothesis around that phenomena, and then do an investigation as to, do an investigation using the scientific method to determine, and what I'm seeing actually happening. And so beyond that, so then scientists will do the research, they'll write their paper, and then you will have other scientists, people that were not involved in the process, looking at this and picking it apart and saying, is the hypothesis aligned with the end result, so to speak? Are these things congruent? So you have teams of people looking at research papers and looking at scientific articles, asking these deep questions. And so we need to acknowledge that, like, modern medical science and science in general have that aspect, that kind of communal aspect of, like, let's pick this apart and look for any potential bias that could be there. Even though, as I was saying earlier, science as a methodology seeks to take out bias. And so we have this kind of, in a yogic sense, we have this continual discovery going on, but we don't have these teams of people outside of ourselves saying, I think you're being a little biased about your experience. So, this is where we need to have these conversations about. This is what happens in this, in the modern scientific method. This is what happens in the yogic sciences, and it's not that one is better than the other. I don't want that impression to be interpreted here. It's that how can we acknowledge both and stand firmly in the middle ground, in the middle way, so to speak, and acknowledge both realities of these things. Um, I just wanted to point to this. There's this notion in the yoga world, because we're doing all this work around decolonizing, that science is trying to colonize the world. And I think that's a disingenuous argument. Because, and again, there's that divide between science and indigenous traditions. And when you look at this pandemic, the reality is that we would not have been able to develop COVID vaccinations as quickly as we did in the time span of a year if worldwide scientists from India, from Africa, from Europe, from Russia, from China, from America, Canada, England, from all of these countries, if the entire global scientific community did not work together to formulate COVID vaccinations. So I think we have to be very careful about, saying that science is trying to colonize yoga or trying to colonize indigenous traditions. I don't think that's the case, because indigenous people themselves are involved in the modern scientific method. And it's just creating a bigger divide in the holistic health and wellness space. Now, that's not at all to say don't do decolonization work. I absolutely 100% support that. But we have to be able to pick apart where these narratives, in becoming as big of a conversation as they are, we have to be able to pick apart where these narratives are just kind of incongruent. And that's just another example to me of not only incongruency, but of people trying to divide science and spirituality. And I don't think that's what we should do. So to get back to your question of how can people deal with anti-science when they sense it in yoga studios? That's a hard question. I think I would suggest that people, these are hard conversations to have. And of course, not everybody has medical training or science training. But, I do think that this is where we can practice our yoga, is how can we communicate ideas to people. And I may not be an expert on this. You may want to talk to a psychologist about that. But how can we communicate ideas in a loving and yogic way while still getting across ideas that may contrast people's confirmation bias? That's the big question.
That's beautifully said. Oh my gosh, it's so true.
Yeah, and I'll be the first one to admit that I don't always do it the best sometimes. Sometimes I get frustrated, sometimes I get angry, and sometimes I react. Sometimes I'm not living my yoga in the moment. And if you go on maybe some of my social media, you might see that. But, I think it, especially for healthcare professionals, we study this stuff day in and day out. And it's so incredibly frustrating. It's almost, I would kind of make this comparison as it's so frustrating for many of, South Asian persons to witness their indigenous tradition being colonized and appropriated. It feels the same for people that study science to be putting out all this useful information, and then for people to be contorting it and manipulating it to suit their own agenda. especially healthcare professionals that are doing it, where you know that they've studied these things, and they're promoting misinformation. It's just this, your heart sinks to your stomach and you think, oh my God, how did we get to this place? Is really, really the feeling that it produces.
Yeah.
So,
Gosh, I
yeah.
appreciate
So,
your thoughts so much on this, especially the conversation of colonization and science. I did not even consider this. I haven't heard it. Like, I haven't even thought of that or heard that. This is so nuanced. I would encourage our connected yoga teachers to follow you on social media. I love how you also said sometimes you get angry. So do I. Sometimes I am here on the podcast, like lashing out a little bit, and you've just reminded me today to come in and find out, like, all right, how can I reduce suffering in myself? How can I serve others? How can I care for others? How can I'm leaving with this question of, like, how can I connect again to that spirituality on the days when I'm leaning really heavy into science? So thank you for all of
oh,
this.
you're welcome. I'm glad to do this, and I look forward to hopefully facilitating this in other places as well, because I want this message to get out.
Yeah. How can our connected yoga teachers follow you and find out more? Where's the best place that they go?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram and TikTok at Future NMD Yogi. The NMD stands for Naturopathic Medical Doctor. I'm a future naturopathic medical doctor, just to be clear about that. I'm not a doctor yet. But yeah, Future NMD Yogi on Instagram and TikTok. I also recently started a new Instagram page solely focused on integrative medicine, which is this integration of modern medical science with indigenous healing traditions, focusing on providing affirming, LGBT affirming integrative medicine. So I started a second page on Instagram called Queer Trans Thriving. So you
I'm
can,
following it. I'll make sure that we link to it in our show notes.
awesome.
Thank you so much for the work that you're doing in the world, and thanks for your time today.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here.
Thank you again, Stevie, for your time, for the work that you're doing in the world, even on the difficult days, and also just for this conversation. I feel like it has really stuck with me, and it has made me ask myself, am I leaning towards science in a way that kind of makes it be out of balance in my own life and in my own experience? So I appreciated this so much. I feel like there was so much to think on. We covered a lot of ground in this interview, and I'm curious to hear from our listeners. I'd love to know, what were the questions that came up for you? What were the feelings or emotions that came up? Share with us if you'd like to. You can head on over to our show notes page. That's over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/296. Down at the bottom of our show notes, you can leave a comment about this episode so other listeners can read those comments as well. Or maybe you'd like to send a personal voice message. You can do that from our homepage over at theconnectedyogateacher.com. Or there's a place on our website where you can also send us a personal email if you don't want anyone else to hear about it, just our team over here. You are more than welcome to let us know that it's a private email. You don't want us to read any parts of it over on the podcast here. But if you do want us to share and continue this conversation, another great place to do that is our Facebook group, theconnectedyogateacher.com. If you head on over to our website, you can see the join button on our homepage. We are having a lot of conversations over there, especially when the podcast releases on Mondays. We like to continue the conversation there. If you would like to hang out in real time, we have the workshop with Jessica and Alyssa that I talked about. It's called Blurred Lines, the Harmful Intersection of Diet Culture and Yoga. That's happening November the 3rd, 2022. There is a replay that is available for the whole month of November for everyone who registers. I feel like this is a must for all yoga teachers, especially when we are hosting yoga spaces. This is the information that you need to know to get diet culture out of our yoga spaces and to keep our students safe. The sign up for that is over at theconnectedyogateacher.com/anti-diet, or we'll put a link in the show notes as well. Also in November, over inside of Pelvic Health Professionals, we are going to be talking about hypermobility and how that impacts our pelvic health. And that's with Libby Hinesley, who's been on the podcast before as an amazing guest. Libby is so gifted at talking about hypermobility and anatomy and really nerding out on all things yoga and how the body works. And we're really going to dive in and talk about hypermobility and how that impacts our pelvic health. So if you are curious about that, head on over to pelvichealthprofessionals.com and check that out, along with all of the other resources in there. That's where I mostly hang out in person. And I will be back here again next week on the podcast. And we are going to be talking about another topic that's like, can these both exist? Rebecca Sebastian is going to be on the podcast talking about business and yoga philosophy. I cannot wait for you to hear this conversation with us. One of Rebecca's main goals was to make me laugh, she said. She definitely did that right from the beginning of the interview. But we also got serious and talked about why it is so difficult sometimes for yoga teachers to be running a business, to be making money, and how does this all fit in with yoga philosophy? So I will see you back here next week. Thank you to our entire team over here, Suzanne, Crunch, and Sinead, who make this podcast possible, but who also do all kinds of other things to really care for the community of connected yoga teachers. I also want to say a huge thank you to you, dear listener. You make this podcast possible. You're doing amazing work out in the world. If you are ever having a day where you are doubting yourself or feeling like, oh my gosh, is anyone going to sign up for this offering, this yoga class that I have? Does anyone care about this? Is this making a big enough impact in the world? Please know that yes, you're doing amazing work. We don't always see the ripple of impact that we have as yoga teachers, but every once in a while we catch a glimpse of it, and it can be life-changing for people to come into a space where they feel like they can let the nervous system down-regulate, where they can feel like they are part of a community and safe in that community and cared for, where they can really connect to themselves and move their body and all of the amazing benefits that yoga can give to someone. So as you're doing this workout in the world and as you're helping people to find that on their own, I'm curious to know, what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?